Good evening. I see we already have a couple of scholars here. So who do we have so far? Excuse me. So why don't we begin with a word of prayer? Lord God, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts upon your holy scriptures be acceptable in your sight, for you are our strength and our wisdom, and for that we give you thanks. Amen. So as I indicated in the email that I sent out earlier today, it's a little unusual. I don't preach on the same passage so soon after having done it recently, and I did use this scripture for a sermon back in February, but I just feel the Spirit nudging me along in this direction, and maybe you'll see why as we go on this evening. The passage is from John's Gospel, and as some of you have heard me say, if you want to get close to the historical Jesus, don't go to John's Gospel, go to Matthew, Mark, and Luke. They were the first that were written. John was written much later, about 100 AD. John's Gospel reflects the emerging theology or Christology understanding of who Jesus was in the early church. Matthew, Mark, and Luke are closer to the historical Jesus, and they're sometimes called the synoptic gospel. So the prefix syn, synthesize, to bring together. Synoptic, same, I. Matthew, Mark, and Luke, it's almost as if they're looking at Jesus through the same pairs of eyes, although there are differences between the different gospels. And 90% of John's gospel you won't find in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. That's how different they are. One of the biggest differences is in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, you have what is known as the Messianic secret. Jesus would perform a miracle and he would say, shh, don't tell anyone about it. And the reason why is because people were expecting a Messianic, militaristic leader. And Jesus knew that if word started getting out that he was the Messiah and people started clamoring for him to start the revolution, his ministry would be over before it even began. In John's Gospel, there is no Messianic secret. Jesus is out there in all of his glory. He's right from the very beginning making it very clear who he is and why he's here. So with all of that as a preface, why don't we look at this passage from John's Gospel, and it is the famous "Let him who is without sin cast the first stone" passage. It's in John chapter 8, beginning with the second verse. Early in the morning, Jesus came again to the temple. All the people came to him, and he sat down and he taught them. The scribes and the Pharisees brought a woman who had been caught in adultery, and placing her in the midst, they said to him, "Teacher, this woman has been caught in the act of adultery. Now, in the law, Moses commanded us to stone such women. So what do you say?" This they said to test him, that they might have some charge to bring against him. Jesus bent down and wrote with his finger on the ground. And as they continued to ask him, he stood up and said to them, "Let him who is without sin among you be the first to throw a stone at her." And once more, he bent down and wrote on the ground. But when they heard it, they went away one by one, beginning with the older ones. And Jesus was left alone with the woman standing before him. Jesus stood up and said to her, "Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you?" She said, "No one, Lord." And Jesus said, "Neither do I condemn you. Go, and from now on sin no more." So as I said, probably one of the most famous stories in all of the Gospels, one of the most famous quotes attributed to Jesus, "Let him who is without sin cast the first stone." We've all heard that many times, I'm sure. And so my question is, what does this story have to say to us today? And clearly it is saying something to me, because I found myself circling around and returning to this story after having preached on it just a couple of months ago. And let me begin by asking this question. Who is the sinner in this story? Obviously, you could say the Pharisees. The Pharisees were hypocrites. We know they are hypocrites because that whole little aspect of the story where Jesus is kneeling down and writing on the ground, and we can't be 100% sure of what he was writing in the ground, but one guess, and it makes a lot of sense actually, is that when they tell him that the law of Moses says that they are supposed to stone the woman to death, it's possible that Jesus bent down and in the ground he was writing the words to that commandment. Because what we know is that the commandment that they're referencing says that both the man and the woman were to be stoned to death. So where was the guy? Why didn't the Pharisees bring him to Jesus as well? They couldn't say that they didn't know who the guy was, because they had already said to Jesus that they had caught the woman in the very act of adultery. Well, if they caught her in the very act of adultery, that means that not only did they know who she was, they knew who the guy was. But in an ancient application of the old double standard, they let the guy go and dragged the poor woman to Jesus. So if they're going to fulfill the commandment and be faithful to the commandment, they have to have the guy there to be punished as well. But they didn't. So they're sinners. You can also see this because they really could have given two hoots about this woman. Notice in verse 6, This they said to test him, that they might have some charge to bring against him. What that clearly says is that they weren't really interested in making sure that this woman got punished. They were trying to get Jesus in trouble. And like so many instances, they think that they have Jesus backed into a corner with a no-win scenario in front of him. The way they figured it, Jesus had one of two options. He could say, yep, go ahead and stone her to death. But if that's what he had said and people in the crowd started throwing stones at her, the Pharisees would have made a beeline to Pilate, the Roman governor, because only the Romans had the authority to put someone to death. And it makes sense. The Romans wanted to be in control. And, as I was just sharing that with you, it just reminded me, some of you might remember many years ago, we had a woman come and give a sermon, actually, in our church. Her name was Sonia Weitz. Sonia Weitz was a survivor of the Holocaust. She used to live in Peabody. She passed away a few years ago. And she wrote a book of poetry called I Promised I Would Tell. And those were the last words that she said to her mother before her mother was hauled off to one of the camps. Excuse me, it's the other way around. The mother said to Sonia, promise me that you will tell the world what happened here. Sonia Weitz, in that sermon to our congregation, shared this unbelievable story. She said there was an elderly Jewish man in one of the camps, and one day he just reached the point where he couldn't take it anymore. So he threw himself on the barbed wire and cut himself all up so that he could bleed to death. The Germans were furious. They rushed him to the infirmary. They sewed him all up. And then they brought him back and they hung him. Because the message was, you don't get to decide when you die, we decide. And that's sort of the situation with the Romans. The Romans wanted to make it clear, you don't have ultimate authority, Jewish people, over life and death. That's us. Only we can do that. So if Jesus had said to the disciples, yeah, go ahead and, the Pharisees said, go ahead and stone her to death. The Pharisees would have run to Pilate and said, hey, this Jesus guy, he's causing trouble here. So Jesus would have gotten in trouble with the Romans. On the other hand, if Jesus said, no, let her go, it would have made him look soft on adultery, so to speak. It would have lost him some credibility with the people in general. And in fact, this is the very reason why you will not find this story in some early manuscripts. If you have a Revised Standard Version of the Bible, I invite you at some point to open your Bible to chapter 8 in John's Gospel and look for this story. You won't find it. You'll see that chapter 8 in John's Gospel actually begins with verse 12. Honest, you test me on this one. What you will see, though, is a notation referring you to a footnote at the bottom of the page. And you will see on the bottom of the page in the Revised Standard Version this story, along with a note that says some ancient manuscripts do not include this story. What we believe is that it isn't there because the early church fathers thought that Jesus was being soft on immorality. so that they took it out of some of the manuscripts. So clearly, the Pharisees are sinners. They're hypocrites. They're full of pride. They're scheming. They're devious. And I'm sure you can think of a few other words. My question is, are there any other sinners in this story? What do you think? Obviously, not to Jesus. Jesus was without sin. Otherwise, he couldn't have been the perfect sinner. I mean, the perfect sacrifice. And I'm just curious. I'm wondering if people are not able to type anything, because I'm not getting any feedback or anything. So I'm hoping that that's not the case. So if somebody would type something in there so that I can see that it's working, that would be very helpful. So Jesus is without sin. The only one left is the woman. And clearly, she has sinned. There's no way of fluffing that over. She was caught in the very act of adultery. In that respect, the Pharisees were right. The Pharisees were wrong in that they didn't bring the man too, but this woman had committed the sin of adultery. And Jesus acknowledges that. It isn't as if he turns a blind eye to what she had done, because when he asks her, "Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you?" She said, "No, Lord." And Jesus said, "Neither do I condemn you. Go, and from now on, sin no more." So Jesus, he's not letting her off scot-free. He's holding her accountable, just not to the extent that the Pharisees might have wanted. So everyone here is a sinner in this story, in one way or another. And I'm not a big fan of saying, okay, this is a big sin and this is a little sin. It's sort of like, little white lies. It's not an out and out really bad lie. It's just a little white lie. But it's still a lie. I had a conversation a number of years ago with a member of our congregation. She's since moved to New Hampshire, and she worked in a nursing home. It's specialized in memory loss. And I remember her telling me once about something called a therapeutic untruth. And I said, "What does that mean?" And she said, well, for example, if we have someone and they're visiting their mother, and the mother has Alzheimer's, but isn't so far gone that she doesn't realize who her daughter is or son is, and it's time for the son or daughter to leave. Well, the mother gets all upset. "Oh, please don't leave me. Please don't leave me." And the son or daughter feels terrible and doesn't know what to do. And this woman, congregation, said, "We tell them to say a therapeutic untruth." Essentially what you do is, or they say, you tell the person, or you tell the mother, "You know what, I have some pictures in the car I want to show you. I'm going to go get them and I'll be back in a little bit." And the mother isn't upset because the son or daughter said, I'm coming back. And of course they don't. Well, what happens is the mother, because of her memory loss, very quickly forgets that the person was even there. And so the day goes on and the parting isn't as traumatic. She said, that's a therapeutic untruth. And I said, but that's a lie. And she said, yes, but it's one that is designed out of a sense of love. And I understand that. And I can understand saying that to a son or daughter so that they don't go through this traumatic goodbye every time. But that's a little dangerous because then we get in the situation with, well, if it's a therapeutic untruth, there must be other situations where it's okay to bend the truth a little or not be completely honest. And we play all kinds of games like this. And that's dangerous. And so what I've been seeing here as I've been reflecting on this passage from John's gospel is one of the dangers is we say, oh, well, the sinners are over there. Yeah, the woman, she sinned too, but comparatively speaking, she wasn't as bad as the person over there. And I begin to think maybe it's not good for us to play these games where we try to say, well, that person's a worse sinner than this person. And maybe just to see all of us as sinners. And to take sin seriously. We don't do that today in our society for various reasons. You're not supposed to make people feel guilty. And yet, over the last week, I've been thinking more and more about whether we'd be better off if we took sin a little more seriously. And I've been thinking about this because of the death of George Floyd. What happened there was sinful. It breaks my heart. I feel terrible for his family. I also feel bad for the officer who's now been charged with, I think it's third-degree murder. His life is ruined forever. And his wife has already filed for divorce. She wants to change her name, cut her ties with him completely. And then you have the people who have been protesting, and it's been, what's the word I'm trying to think of? It's been descending into violence and chaos and looting. And I just wonder if we took sin more seriously, would a lot of the terrible things that are going on right now not have happened? If that officer, I forget his first name, I think his last name is Chauvin, Chauvin, if he took sin more seriously, maybe he doesn't keep his knee on George Floyd's neck for 8 or 9 minutes, particularly since George Floyd was handcuffed. And, George Floyd was a sinner too. He didn't deserve what happened to him by any stretch of the imagination. But they found 2 different kinds of drugs in his system, illegal drugs. I just find myself thinking that maybe we need to take sin more seriously. And not just in the sense the Pharisees did, where they pointed the finger and said, that woman over there, she's a sinner. Maybe if the Pharisees took sin a little more seriously, they don't drag the woman without the man to Jesus in the first place. And maybe if they take sin a little more seriously, they don't play this game with Jesus and try to trick him and get him into trouble with the Romans. We're living in a society that more and more is doing away with sin. In fact, was a famous psychoanalyst. I think it's Carl Menninger. And he wrote a book. The title was Whatever Happened to Sin? And, we go to great lengths to do away with it. Some of you have heard me say this. Look at some of the euphemisms we use these days for sin. So, for example, when we celebrate communion, we always include before that sacrament a prayer of confession. And over the years, I've heard ministers say, let us confess our transgressions. Sounds nicer. It's sort of like calling a janitor a custodian, or there was another word I was trying to think of, but or a housewife, a domestic engineer. So we don't even like using the word sin. We let us confess our transgressions. Or my favorite, you hear every once in a while, let us confess our humanity before God. Now, I don't know about you, but I have no problem whatsoever admitting to everyone and to God that I'm a human being. But it's a little harder to admit that I am a sinful human being. Now, I'm not suggesting we need to go maybe to the extent of AA, where the first meeting, the person has to stand up and say, hi, my name is Rick, I'm an alcoholic. Or for our purposes, hi, everybody, my name is Rick, I'm a sinner. But we need to start taking sin seriously, not just so that we beat ourselves down, but so that we can be the people God created us to be, so that we can take seriously God's commandments and not make excuses. Oh, yeah, it's a little white lie, but it's not like I went behind the person's back and said something untrue. I'm thinking of using this in the sermon Sunday. As I was reflecting on all of this, I was reminded of a gentleman who came to my office many years ago. It's when I was starting out as an associate pastor up in South Portland, Maine. And the man was in my office because his wife had discovered that he was having an affair. Now, I knew the family, I knew the situation, and he was really beating himself up. And I said, well, you know, it isn't easy, I'm sure, referring to his marriage. And, you know, don't be too hard on yourself. You know, use this as an opportunity to, and all of a sudden he looked at me and he said, don't do that. And I said, don't do what? He said, you're trying to make me feel better. Don't do that. I've done something wrong and I'm supposed to feel guilty. He was right. We need to take sin seriously. And I include myself in that as well. And at this point, I'm guessing that our chat box is not functioning. So what I'm going to do is, if you have a comment or a question in the time that we have left, email me at pastor, Pastor, at nrucc.org. So it's an abbreviation for North Reading Union Congregational Church. So again, if you have a comment or a question, email it to me at pastor at nrucc.org. You know, I'll give you another example of how we're taking sin less seriously. And again, this goes back to when I was first starting out. And again, I'm on the marriage path here tonight. So when I would meet with a couple who are going to get married, I generally meet with them 3 times. The first time, I would just focus on, and I'm just trying to get to my, here we go. Oh my goodness. Okay, thank you, Andy. I'm getting all of this. Yeah, you're right, Leslie. The Pharisees never knew that Jesus knew what they were thinking and that he was always a step ahead of them. Yeah, the punishment doesn't fit the crime. Yep. Thank you. So you're able to see the typing, but I'm not for some reason. Huh. Wow. It's my fault. It has to be. Yeah. So when I would meet with a couple, the first meeting would be sort of a get to know you. I'd have a form and we'd go down the form and we'd put down who is going to be the best man and who is going to be the maid or the matron of honor, the ushers, the bridesmaids, all of that kind of stuff. Flower girl, ring bearer. By the way, I know what I'm talking about here. If you're going to have problems with a wedding, in a wedding, it's almost always going to be the ring bearer. Some of my most memorable weddings have involved ring bearers. In fact, on my form, when I get to flower girl and ring bearer, underneath each, there's a line for age. And if I would say, how old is the ring bearer? And I'd get a response like, oh, he's 3, but he's very mature for his age, I always knew I was in trouble. Well, on this form, there is information like telephone number. Back then we didn't have email, and address. And it didn't matter if I started with the groom's information or the bride's information. So for sake of argument, let's say I'm meeting with a couple and I start with the groom and I say, okay, name, middle name, and date of birth. Have you ever been married before? Is this your first marriage? Telephone number and address. Then I'd move on to the bride and same thing, name, middle name, date of birth, first marriage, if a second marriage, did the first marriage end in divorce, death, things like that, telephone number. And then when I would get to address, I'd get same. So if they were living together, and this is back in the early 80s, there was an embarrassment about living together. And so they would never even look me in the eye. They would look down and just saying, today, don't think anything of it. Now, I'm not going to pass judgment. I will say that one of the questions that I ask in a situation like that is, you've been living together for X number of years or months or whatever it is. So why are you deciding to get married now? A lot of times the answer is, oh, well, we want to start a family. And one of the things that people will often say is, well, we want to live together because we want to make sure that we're compatible. Now, again, I'm not passing judgment. What I will do, though, is I will offer up a reality, which is that living together because we want to make sure that we're compatible isn't a good reason for this particular reason. They've done studies, and you think that if a couple live together before getting married, the divorce rate would be less. The reality is studies have shown that the divorce rate is higher, which is counterintuitive. One of the reasons for that is because marriage changes the dynamics. If you're living together, it's sort of like playing house, and you know that you can stop playing the game at any time. But living together, getting married, it's entirely different. Again, I share that not as a judgment, but in this sense that if we took God's way of living and commandments, ground rules, whatever you want to call them, seriously, we would be so much better off in so many ways. And if we took God's commandments seriously, then maybe that officer doesn't have his knee on George Floyd's neck for 8-9 minutes. Because he knows that this is a person created in God's image, that this isn't a thing, this is a person. And so if he took sin more seriously, then maybe his life isn't ruined forever now. And people who were looting and whatnot, it's going to catch up with them. And, if they took sin seriously, then they would know that the window that they just threw a brick through and they're running into loot now is owned by someone. And very often these are people that don't have a lot. I've read 2 or 3 stories in the paper about hardworking mom and pops whose stores have been destroyed, and now they're suffering. And maybe if we took sin seriously, our elected leaders wouldn't be trying to score points off of everything that's happening. And I just lost my train of thought. There was something else, and it was going to be a good point too. But anyways, let me see if I've got any more. Oh, Leslie. No, I didn't accidentally hit the hide chat button because I can see the 2 posts, but it says unable to connect. Oh, I'm just seeing this now. So on my end, it's saying unable to connect to chat. Please try again later. But you're all able to post things, I'm guessing. So, my goodness, so you're all talking behind my back. How sinful is that? Let's see. Yeah, I'm not sure. I'll have to check on that, why it's saying that I can't connect to chat, which, let me try up here. Live chat. Participants. Pop out chat. I don't know what that is. And toggle timeshare. Oh, that. So it's only saying that I'm the only participant here. Huh. Uh-oh. Sorry about that. I hit something. I got a big screen about chat dynamics. And yep. So I can see that I posted something at 5:35 p.m. inviting people to post questions and comments. And then I put something in at 7 p.m. that, again, welcome people and invited them to, or all of you, to post questions and comments. So I'm sorry. I'll tell you, this technology is going to be the death of me yet. I just think I'm getting the hang of it, and then something like this comes up. But this just illustrates that there's a difference between sin and just stupid. And when it comes to stuff like this, I'm not a sinner, but I am stupid. And that's okay. I'll tell you a quick story. And this might have been a little sinful, actually. And if I'm repeating myself, I do apologize. So when I was going to get my first inspection sticker, my father said, "Come with me. I'm going to get my inspection sticker. You need to get yours for your car." And just as we were leaving, my father said, "Don't worry about your left front tire. You might not get your inspection sticker because it's worn, but don't worry about it." Well, of course, that's the worst thing my father could have said. And we got there, and he got his inspection sticker. And of course, this is back when you stayed in the car and you just followed the prompts that the owner of the gas station would give you. Turn your windshield wipers on, honk your horn, put your blinkers on, and put your headlights on, and then your high beams. So the guy says, "Okay, put your headlights on," and I did. It was actually a button you pulled out, and it's an old '65 Mustang. And then he said, put your high beams on. Now, some of you may not be old enough to remember, but this was back when cars, the high beam was actually a little button on the floor that you pushed with your foot. And I had a 65 Mustang that was a standard. And all of a sudden I'm thinking to myself, how do I get my foot off the clutch to push that little button to make the high beams work? Silly me, I didn't even think that just put it in neutral. And the guy had a long list waiting line of cars. And so he said, put your high beams on. So I thought, okay, foot comes off the clutch, high beams worked great, but the car didn't stall, it lurched forward. And I panicked and I did it again. The poor guy literally was trying to climb onto my hood. If I had done it a third time, I would have pinned him against the back wall. And my beloved father, God rest his soul, is standing over on the side, and he looks and he said, do it again, stupid. And that became quite a story over the year. And then it got worse because the inspector, he comes over and he's literally trembling. I swear he gave me my inspection sticker out of fear. And he says, give me your registration. And I'm thinking, registration, right? What's that? Is that the thing my mother told me not to keep in the car? Confusing it with the title. So I reached into the glove compartment and got the registration, gave it to him. But what I didn't realize is when I reached into the glove compartment, there was a toggle switch in there for the hazard lights, the blinkers. So the guy comes out and he's giving me my inspection sticker and he says, you can turn your blinkers off. And I'm just here like, I don't know what's going on. My father looked over there, he's shaking his head, he says, what'd you do, break that too? So, oops, here we go. Oh, some more what I'm missing. Okay, got a few minutes here. So, oh my goodness, you all just having a regular old party over there. Okay, yep. Oh, maintenance engineer, yep. Yes, Andy, the officer did have 18 previous complaints on his records, and there's another example of sin. His superiors who just, oh, boys will be boys. Passing notes in class. Oh my goodness. Oh, you guys are a riot. Wait a minute. What's Tom's theory here? Oh my goodness. Oh, I'm so disappointed I wasn't a part of this. Yeah. So again, that's where I am with all of this. And I have always told our student ministers in years gone by that if you can't tell me what the sermon is in one sentence, you're not ready to preach it. And thanks to this evening, the one sentence summary for the sermon Sunday is, we need to start taking sin seriously again. Not to use guilt as a weapon, but so that we can stop doing some of the things that are only making our lives and the world around us worse. So, last thing I will say is that someone was talking to me once about being a minister and about guilt, and I said, yep. I said, my job is to make people feel guilty, and I love my job. But in seriousness, it's only to bring about healing and a better person and a better world. So with all of that, I thank you. And next week, I will figure out why I wasn't able to see the wonderful conversation all of you were having. So again, God bless, stay safe, good night.